respeto y dignidad para Culebra y Vieques ya. Respeto y dignidad para Culebra y Vieques ya. Transporte digno y hospital para Culebra y Vieques ya. Respeto y dignidad para Culebra y Vieques ya. Las vidas culebrenses y viequenses valen de verdad y por siempre las vamos a respetar. Respeto y dignidad para Culebra y Vieques ya. Qué chévere es ir para allá para turistear, sí. Y más chévere sería tener lancha y hospital. Respeto y dignidad para Culebra y Vieques ya. Después de tantos años luchando por la paz, nuestra gente merece eso y mucho más. Respeto y dignidad para Culebra y Vieques ya. Ay, pero ¿cuándo será que tendremos respeto en nuestra tierra natal? Respeto y dignidad. Despierta, Boricua. Para Culebra y Vieques ya. Pero ya, para Culebra y Vieques ya. Queremos justicia para esta humanidad. Para Culebra y Vieques ya. Por las vidas queridas que ya no están. Para Culebra y Vieques ya. Ay, que este reclamo se haga escuchar. Para Culebra y Vieques ya. Aunque lo intenten, no nos desplazarán. Para Culebra y Vieques ya. Somos de aquí nos vamos a quedar. Para Culebra y Vieques ya. Respeto, justicia y dignidad es natural. Para Culebra y Vieques ya. Respeto, justicia y dignidad debería ser normal. Para Culebra y Vieques ya. Es la solución, sí, que hemos de lograr. Para Culebra y Vieques ya. Transporte digno y buen hospital apunta. Para Culebra y Vieques ya.
Welcome, comrades and friends, to tonight's Workers' World Party live stream, where hundreds of revolutionaries from across the world gather to strategize, to analyze, and to build the struggle for the workers' world, for a socialist future. I just want to start tonight by saying that it was exactly 211 years ago tonight that Father Miguel Hidalgo rang the bells of his church, calling the forces of Mexican national liberation to arms, and thus started the battle for Mexico's independence from Spain, which came 200 years ago this month. And while the collapsing Spanish Empire would rescind its claim of ownership over the islands of Puerto Rico before the end of that century, United States imperialism was snatching up the land of indigenous people in the Americas, as well as the peoples of the Caribbean and Pacific. It was during this imperialist rivalry that Pedro Albizu Campos was born. El Maestro was a political theorist, an orator, an anti-colonial icon, and a leader and militant. And he called for armed uprising against the imperialist domination of Puerto Rico. He was born also in September, 130 years ago this week. The United States did what they do. They killed Albizu Campos through their prisons. It's how they gradually assassinate political opposition by way of medical neglect and toxic prison conditions. After his death in 1965, the mantle of revolution was taken up by many others, the young lords in Lincoln Park and in the Bronx, from East Florida to East Harlem, and inside the belly of the beast in Greenhaven Prison and Attica Prison, inside the very system that the US used to assassinate Albizu Campos. Today is also the anniversary of the landfall of Hurricane Maria, which brings us to our topic tonight. The ocean is boiling, it's swelling with melting Arctic ice, and capitalism and imperialism is the cause of this crisis. The struggle for liberation of Puerto Rico is, in other words, is historic and it's ongoing. So I want to get right into it and introduce our guests tonight. Please also make sure to share the live stream of this video on Facebook and Twitter and wherever you can post. I want to invite everybody to join this conversation by sharing on social media and by posting your comments and questions on Zoom. And I would love to pull some of you into the conversation tonight to ask questions and to speak with our guests. My name is Ted Kelly. My pronouns are she and her. I am a member of Workers' World Party Philadelphia. And now, without further ado, let me introduce our guests tonight. Lorraine Lopez is a member of a call to action on Puerto Rico, Workers' Assembly Against Racism, and the Latinx caucus of the Green Party. Fermin Morales is an IBEW electrical worker and electrician and a member of Philly Boricuas. And Vanessa Maria is a member of Philly Boricuas, just returned from Puerto Rico only a few days ago. Welcome, everybody. I thank you so much for being on tonight. It's really exciting to speak with you all. I want to start maybe by asking Lorraine to kick us off and talking about the situation that's going on in Puerto Rico. In order to do so, we want to talk about how we got to this point. Before the George Floyd uprising last summer, Puerto Ricans were taken to the streets in recent years in incredible numbers to protest the colonial trap that they are put in right now. As long as there's been colonization, there's been resistance. Lorraine, could you talk about the history of that resistance, the different phases of resistance that Puerto Rico has gone through?
Trying to get myself. Okay.
I hear you, Lorraine.
Sorry.
Just good to see it. No, you're fine.
I get the video to work.
We see you.
All right. We always have a tech challenge. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Workers' World Party for this invitation and always being supportive of Puerto Rico. We were able to publish several articles from a call to action on Puerto Rico. I just would like to acknowledge for a moment those who passed in Hurricane Maria. If we can have a moment of silence, because there's just so much pain and so much trauma as a result of what happened. So I'll ask everyone for just a moment of silence. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We recognize that this event is something that will always impact us tremendously for years to come. And so, talking about Maria is a very painful process. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. I also want to say that on Monday, I just want to make this, on Monday, there's going to be the memorial, the Organización Ocho is going to have a memorial for the victims of Hurricane Maria. And you can look it up on the pages of Pro Libertad and also La Organización Ocho. So I'm just going to go into a little bit of the background or the context historically of the resistance of Puerto Rico. I'd like to say that since the beginning of colonialism, 123 years back, there's always been resistance. And oftentimes, as we know, history is done by the perspective of who is telling the story. So unfortunately, that story has been told by the empire and not the colony. So I want to make it very clear to everyone that Puerto Ricans from the very beginning have been in resistance. And I'm just going to highlight some things because it's a very long history. And I'm going to ask people to visit different books and different things that could help them to understand and contextualize this. All the way going back to Don Pedro Aviso Campo, who's the head of the Nationalist Party. We have had people that have been in the streets, and we have had women. I want to say that the Puerto Rican woman is the heart of the resistance in Puerto Rico. And we have had Blanca Canales, who led a revolt in Jayuya and in the 50s. And she was incarcerated along with Don Pedro Aviso Campos, right? We've had a long history of the US government that has had files and has followed people in the independence movement and had them blacklisted so that they were not able to get jobs in Puerto Rico. And that's why you have a diaspora here that is independentista, who is revolutionary and who is militant because of that exile. We also know that we are in the third phase of the restructuring of our relationship with the colony of Puerto, with the empire, right? The beginning was the agriculture, right? How the US government devalued the money that Puerto Ricans had. It took their land away and it brought in large corporations, right? To run sugarcane and coffee, right? And then there was movements, right? There was strikes by workers, right? Who wanted better wages and better pay. And so in the second phase in the 50s was when you had the industrialization of Puerto Rico. And you had this political campaign that was saying that Puerto Ricans were overpopulated. And you had women that were sterilized without their consent. Okay, so Puerto Rican women have been the group of women that have been most sterilized in the entire world. Women were sterilized so that they can be available for the textile industries. So they were actually given time off from work so that they could go get la operación. That's what it was called, the operation, okay? And this operation was so that women would be available, so that industry, capitalism, would benefit from their labor. And so this was the second restructuring. And then you had the issue that Puerto Rico was in the United Nations as part of the colonies. So the lie was created, right? The lie was created that Puerto Rico was going to be a commonwealth and that they were going to have autonomy on their own matters, right? And this commonwealth in Spanish is called el Estado Libre Asociado. That commonwealth, we never stopped being a colony, but we were taken off the list of colonies because it wasn't in the favor on an international basis to have the United States have a colony, right? Particularly in an era of the Cold War, where the US was demonizing what was going on in Cuba. And Cuba was in the forefront of the socialist revolution. And so Puerto Rico was being used to counter that narrative. Okay, so it's very important to understand that. Puerto Rico was used to counter that narrative. And so they had in place, they put 936, where all these American corporations came and they didn't have to pay any taxes. And you saw that Puerto Rico was in a supposed boom, but we know that that was a bubble, right? And now Puerto Rico is in the third phase, right? Where the US government does acknowledge that it's a colony, but it doesn't matter because now you have a debt of $72 billion that was created by the empire in order to fulfill what is the next phase for Puerto Rico, right? In their relationship with the United States, right? And that is an economic sanction, even though the US does not want to recognize this, because the living conditions in Puerto Rico are unlivable for the people of Puerto Rico. And so I equate this promesa bill that came into effect in 2016, signed by the Obama administration, a 7 unelected board members, fiscal control board, was imposed upon the Puerto Rican people to administer the colony's economic situation. And so I'm going to stop at this point because I want to hear from my comrades and I don't want to take too much space. but this is the context where we are right now. So I just want to contextualize it. And thank you so much for this opportunity to speak.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Lorraine, and thank you for that orientation. I wonder if, Fermin, you would talk a little bit more about what austerity is and how the colonial debt is used to really take over countries. And Fermin, just remember to unmute if you could.
Yep. Okay. A lot of the things that went on was basically, first of all, in 1898, when we did have autonomy, we had our own economy. Whether the economy was primitive or not, it was our own economy. Our monetary system was at par with the U.S. dollar. We were able to ship products to Europe. We were able to ship products where we were able to, at that particular moment. When we were attacked in 1898, we were basically imposed a blockade. When you are imposed a blockade, that means they are destroying your economy. In the terms of destroying your economy, now you are being imposed an economy that is not yours. That's what a colony really is. It's an economy that actually isn't grassroots in its own nature, in its own country. It comes from somewhere else. So for so many years, fighting to create your own economy against the empire's economy, a lot of situations happen in which they see that you're in consistent resistance. So they have to sometimes, as they say, throw you a bone or create a situation where you don't rebel as much. So some of the companies that came to Puerto Rico came in through a section called 936 of the tax code, which granted tax exemption from the United States, and they had tax exemption. They would operate in Puerto Rico but not pay taxes, and they would be there on a 10-year basis. And it was basically a lot of times to destroy our own economy, and basically so we didn't compete with them. But what was happening at the same time, it didn't create enough jobs for the people of Puerto Rico. So a lot of them had to migrate. And we've had a situation where we have consistent migration, consistent instability. And so by the early 70s, Puerto Rico was already accumulating a debt. And it seemed like it was the opportune moment for the United States to think about basically to start taking basically every industry that was in the hands of the Puerto Rican people. And that could include the electricity. That could include the phone lines. Later on, it could include the rainforest, our oceans, just about anything that we have. And so in 1984, Congress amended the federal bankruptcy code to exclude Puerto Rico, so Puerto Rico could not declare bankruptcy. It wasn't just Puerto Rico, but all of its territories. So they're setting a stage here for, in other words, to continue to destabilize us. And as we see, as things are going on, since they're now Puerto Rico's now starting to borrow money to be able to maintain its electrical industry, its electrical grid, other areas that they need to protect for the environment, other parts of the economy that needs to be moving. But the minute they got rid of the 936s, these companies just left because Puerto Rico might have a higher labor cost to them. So they can go anywhere, whether it's China, Malaysia, wherever they decide to go, Mexico, where it's cheaper labor. So now you have a vacuum. Now you have people. You create a vacuum. So pretty much all of a sudden in the early 90s, in the year 2006, when 936 was fully repealed, Puerto Rico created right before the hurricane 11 years of a recession, of a deep recession in Puerto Rico. So when you got to 2017, before the hurricane, there was already a deep recession of 11 years. People were leaving Puerto Rico by 40, 50,000 every year. If you look at the population of Puerto Rico, say around the year 2008, it was close to almost 3.8 million people. Go now, and Puerto Rico has almost lost 1 million people since 2008 because people are now leaving. You have doctors that are now leaving. You have teachers that are not educated people, where before you had people that were practically, of the lower class. And so all this is getting to the year 2017 when this hurricane hit. Now you're starting to see the electrical grid because there's not enough money for it, not enough maintenance for it. And there were starting to be small blackouts in smaller towns before 2017. In the town I grew up, we were already having blackouts sometimes at 3 days. We were having blackouts in other areas of 1 day or 2 days because they couldn't maintain the grid. Even if the electricians would say, and the UTL would say, listen, this is what needs to be done. Nobody was listening. Nobody was listening because of the corruption that was going on between the leadership of both parties, the PNP, which is the statehood party, and the PDP, which is the other colonial party. Because they both serve, these two parties both serve their masters, which is the United States Empire. So at September 2016, there was a major power outage that it left 1.5 million people without power. It cut off water service to 340,000 people. This was 2016. This was 1 year before the big hurricane came in 2017. And and everybody knows about the Fiscal Control Board that also came in that year, in which both Democrats and Republicans both voted for the austerity measures. Austerity measures came because of the junk bonds that the government of Puerto Rico sold to Wall Street and to other people. And those junk bonds, basically they could not lose. Once you sold them those junk bonds, in other words, they were going to come back even if they lost their money to say, we need to recuperate our money. And the way they would do it is basically to say, okay, so we have to impose austerity measures so we pay these people in Wall Street, which is simply going to destroy your economy, which is simply, you needed to forgive Puerto Rico of its debt, but you created a law in 1984 that said that Puerto Rico could not declare bankruptcy. So Puerto Rico couldn't restructure that debt. But at the same time, they should have realized that these were junk bonds. And a lot of times when you're in the stock market and you lose your money, you lose your money. Well, these guys have to be paid. Why do these guys have to be paid? And so now you see austerity measures that says Puerto Rico has to sell everything that belongs to it in order to pay these people from Wall Street and basically anybody in Washington, D.C. I'll let somebody else continue, and somebody else needs now to talk. All right.
Thank you, Fermin. I want to get more into the question of not just the electrical infrastructure of Puerto Rico, but also the workers there. But I wonder if before we get there, Vanessa, you were just in Puerto Rico recently. And I think so much about there's this massive displacement of Puerto Ricans. But I feel like Puerto Rican people are not always included in the narrative about the refugee crisis and the migrant struggle. And I wonder if you could talk about from the propaganda and imperial narrative where Puerto Rico sort of falls there.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ted. And it's definitely a privilege to be able to talk about Puerto Rico with the Workers' World Party family out there. So hello to everyone who's listening and watching. Before I get to that, I just want to clarify a couple points, which is we have to acknowledge the long struggle of the resistance fighters of Vieques, right, who accomplished a major achievement, right, in kicking out the US military and ending the bombing campaign, right? And this was honestly a small group of people that did this with no resources. And I just want to underscore this monumental achievement, right, of stopping imperious violence and militarism. Something that has greatly inspired me as a Puerto Rican of the diaspora. And so I just, again, as we're talking about this history of resistance, That is certainly a milestone in our history, and a struggle that still continues as the people that live there continue to suffer the lifelong chronic health issues that are as a result of that radiation and exposure to bombing. And so that's one thing. The second thing is the importance of the student movement in recent years, and how students from the University of Puerto Rico, which we call UP, have played a really active role in continuing to organize and resist the colonization of Puerto Rico. And if we're going by Fermin's timeline, a lot of those big protests started around 2009, 2010. In fact, when I worked for Prometheus Radio Project in West Philly, they contacted us to start a pirate radio station to be able to broadcast what was really happening, because the media in Puerto Rico supports a capitalist, imperialist narrative and is definitely pro-statehood. And is also corporate media, right? That excludes a lot of people and does not allow a diversity of voices. So of course, they looked at pirate radio as a potential solution to be able to talk about the same types of issues that we face in the US, which is, illegal arrests and abuse by police and the suppression of those tactics. And then finally, I just want to clarify that, yes, there was a very big mass mobilization of Puerto Ricans taking to the streets, going on strike, taking over highways, camping out in San Juan at the governor's palace or mansion at La Fortaleza, and, demanding change. However, that protest was not totally a, anti-colonial protest, right? It was definitely broader than that. Certainly, with mass movements, you have affinity groups of all kinds. And there were the anti-imperialist people who are calling for independence of Puerto Rico were there, as they've been leading a lot of these movements. But it's important to note that people were protesting two other things. And one of them is the vile comments that were shared on the Telegram app by the governor and his cabinet that were, criticizing women and had very misogynistic comments, homophobic comments. But the thing that really disrespected Puerto Ricans and offended them was the way in which they talk about the dead people, the people who lost their lives after Hurricane Maria. And for Puerto Ricans, that was very offensive, and that is something that hurt them very deeply, and why people took to the streets. At the same time, the Center for Investigative Journalism in Puerto Rico was also looking into the governor's pay-to-play contracts, where he was giving away millions of dollars in contracts in a scheme operated by him and his closest friends to award contracts to people connected to him or people that were paying to receive these contracts. Something that we know well here in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, right? Pay to play happens everywhere. But at a time when you're supposed to be rebuilding Puerto Rico and providing vital reconstructive services, right? This money was going to waste. A lot of these contracts were awarded and services were never provided. So all of these things really angered Puerto Ricans. And then right before that protest, we had women, as Lorraine had mentioned earlier, organizing against femicide and against domestic violence in Puerto Rico. And there's still a really high rate of violence against women that continues. And they had been going to the Fortaleza and protesting every week. And so it was almost a continuation of that protest, an encampment of women and students who had been going there that exploded into this larger movement. And so I just want people to understand the nuances of what was happening at the time when you saw over 1 million people take to the streets. I recently came back from Puerto Rico, and I could spend a whole hour talking about some of the things that I saw, but I'll get right to the point of the thing that troubled me the most. And it's these corporate tax rates, right, that go hand in hand with austerity measures, right? Because when there is a deficit, these people on the, these unelected people on the financial control board first look to cutting social programs and education, right? That's always like, okay, we'll just cut programs and we'll make up the money that way on the backs of the most vulnerable people and people experiencing poverty. What they should be doing is looking at Act 20 and Act 22 tax laws that give very low corporate tax rates to corporations who are now being based in the island, and for other residents who move to the island because they're exempted from capital gains tax and they're exempted from income tax. And so I was staying in the western part of the island where there is now communities of millionaires forming, right? Like there's gated communities now. There are Bitcoin bros, cryptocurrency folks moving into that area. And what they're doing is holding seminars. Like you've probably heard of a free trip to Florida, right? All you have to do is listen to a seminar and you about a timeshare and they pay for your trip. Well, they're doing the same thing in Puerto Rico. They're flying millionaires out here and cryptocurrency, I call them crypto colonizers, out to the western part of the island because there is an airport in Aguadilla. And they're showing them all of the financial benefits, all of the ways that they can exploit Puerto Rico and take advantage of it. And the thing that, again, was also very shocking is how much land on the western coastline has been bought by Americans and turned into hotels, condos, Airbnbs, golf courses. And now there's huge swaths of land being sold at $7 million, $9 million. And that's something that I had not seen in Puerto Rico, right? So it's something that's very troubling. And we see that here in Philadelphia, right? What happens when developers start to buy up blocks of neighborhoods, right? The rents go up, the taxes go up, people get displaced. And that is happening in real time right now in Puerto Rico. And instead of cutting social programs and education and closing schools, they close over 300 schools in Puerto Rico. You see so many abandoned schools there. It's really disturbing. They should look to recoup the funds lost from these people taking advantage of these tax laws. That is where the money should come from. On our way to liberating Puerto Rico and making it independent. But in the meantime, those people need to pay their fair share and they need to stop coming to Puerto Rico to steal the land and exploit the resources. And so these things are related to the climate crisis, right? Because there are several ways in which they exploit the land and take water. And then they're also trying to change the local culture, right? By exporting US imperialism, which is something that we do all around the world, right? We bring capitalism and we try to promote it and make it so that people buy into this false narrative. Lastly, I'll say that Puerto Rico, like many other Caribbean nations, lacks a diverse independent media and community media. And there's still a lot of people that do not have access to the internet, broadband, and Wi-Fi networks. And after Hurricane Maria, the communications infrastructure was also damaged immensely. And a lot of that infrastructure can only be repaired because they're controlled by US corporations who don't want to invest in that. And so things are really fragile now with the electrical outages, the electrical grid, and the lack of access to communication. And as we know, independent publications like Workers' World are so vital to informing people about all of these stories and being able to oppose imperialism and express dissent and resistance to some of these oppressive policies. And so the result is that many Puerto Ricans don't have a lot of knowledge or information about what's happening on the mainland politically in Washington, all of the policies that affect US colonies and our foreign policy abroad. And there's also, a very unfavorable understanding of Puerto Rican history, right? Because as Lorraine said, it was very taboo to be able to promote independence movements. And a lot of that history is a revisionist history right now, and it's not taught in schools. And so in some ways, the diaspora has a very different viewpoint about Puerto Ricans' independence struggle than those people on the island because of the indoctrination happening in the public schools and the lack of alternative information sources.
This has been such a rich conversation so far, comrades. And the chat is also reflecting that, which is exciting. We have a bunch of people jumping in. Dwight recommends a book, was very excited by Lorraine's comments. The book that Dwight recommended was How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. And then Logan also jumped in to recommend Fantasy Island, Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico. Also, Catherine pointed out that Fermin painted such an accurate picture of the predatory nature of the United States. And we have a shout out from Monisha, who is coming to us from Vieques right now. Maybe when we get more into Vieques and Culebra, we can bring Monisha in. And also Betsy reminded us of how many people who work for the University of Pennsylvania are part of this junta fiscal that is, this colonial government. One thing, Vanessa, that you mentioned was how it's important that we don't flatten the distinctions between different struggles, but the many commonalities between the war being waged against workers in the US and the war being waged on workers in Puerto Rico. And if there are commonalities, it's because they're being done by a common enemy, the banks and the landlords and the billionaires. A few years back, in Detroit, I was able to meet Ricardo Santos Ramos from the Electrical Workers and Irrigation Workers Union. And something he said to me is, if we think statehood is going to save us, I want to invite people to come to Detroit to see what the US government has done to Detroit. I thought that was a potent point. But let's talk about Luma Energy and the crisis with the electrical infrastructure in Puerto Rico. And Fermin, you're a card-carrying union electrical worker yourself. Can you give us a rundown of this crisis? And also, I want to ask you about your analysis of the level of consciousness of your fellow workers in the union here in the US. And just remember to unmute if you could for me.
First of all, Luma is a subsidiary of Quanta Energy. For those of you who don't know, Quanta Energy is a Fortune 500 company. Luma was created from I forget the other company in Canada and Quanta, and it formed Luma in Puerto Rico, and it basically got a no bid so the electric grid and its components could be privatized in Puerto Rico. The battle started when Luma decided, the Puerto Rican workers realized what Luma was all about from the start. And it was basically that they were not going to fix the grid. They were not going to invest in renewable energies. They were just simply going to go there and make money, because they are also, I believe, in South America. They were thrown out of South America. Quanta was thrown out of South America because of the same situation. They came there to make money, but not to repair the telecommunications that they were supposed to do. I think it was, I can't remember the name of the country, but they were thrown out. And so when they came to Puerto Rico, they basically, the UTL, which is the union there, sort of like what the IBW is here. UTL is basically a lot outside linemen that that work on the grid. And so, the country was Peru. They were thrown out of Peru. And so UTL, the UTL decided that they were going to go on strike against Luma. And so when they decided to go on strike against Luma, it was because of the collective bargaining agreement. Luma did not want to use the electricians in Puerto Rico, the unionized electricians in Puerto Rico, because they did not want to respect the collective bargaining. And so because Quanta, the IBW, especially up in the Northeast, were Quanta, some of the subsidiaries in the United States was organized by the IBW. So they already had a connection there was a connection already between Luma and the IBW. So Luma decided that they were going to use electricians from the local 222 in Florida. And so they were going to bring them to the island to work on the electrical grid. Not only are they more expensive than the members of the UTL, but they basically came in there to basically be union busters, because that's what they really are, union busters. The IBW has been told, we have sent faxes to the IBWs, to Washington, D.C., their main office, to some of the locals, local 222, the outside linemen, because those outside linemen can also come invite other unions that are outside linemen, say the outside linemen's in local 126 out of Pennsylvania, if they need more workers to go to work in Puerto Rico and be union busters. Because the idea in reality of Luma and basically the New Progressive Party and the lawyer of the Fiscal Control Board is the governor of Puerto Rico, by the way, is the governor of Puerto Rico. Keep that in mind. What a conflict of interest we're talking about here, that the governor of Puerto Rico is the lawyer of the Fiscal Control Board. So he's not going to go against Luma, which is granted that contract. And so it's basically to destroy the unions in Puerto Rico, which are 4 unions that they're trying to destroy the most powerful union in Puerto Rico. That's what nobody talks about. It is the most radical union in Puerto Rico. It is the most pro-worker union in Puerto Rico, with a lot of them being socialist. Imagine when we talk about the socialism in the 1930s with all those radical unions. Well, that's what the UTL is. That's what the UTL. This is what they're trying to break. This is what they're trying to destroy. Not only that, Luma just put in its contract, they had in their contract that said that the contractors in Puerto Rico couldn't hire the people from the UTL, the electricians from their own island. So now they're practicing even more discrimination against the people of the electricians in the island. And so this is what's going on. This is the battleground that's going on, with the IBW playing the pro-imperialist, syndicate. The pro-imperialist union is going against the non-imperialistic, the one that's fighting back against colonialism.
Thank you, Fermin, for laying that out. And Lorraine, when we were speaking earlier, you used the term colonial unionism. Could you explain that term and maybe draw some more of those connections between Puerto Rican workers and U.S. workers?
Yeah, I use that term colonial unionism. And I say that because there has been a history of unions that have come to Puerto Rico and have basically union busted what have been the local unions there. Right now, what we're witnessing with UTIER, first of all, UTIER was affiliated with the Autoridad Electricidad, right? The Energía, which was the public utility, which was dismantled, right? When the contract was given to Luma Energies. So at that being dismantled, then you have the UTIER workers that don't have the affiliation to the public utility. So they had 2 options. They can join Luma, and as Fermin said, lose their collective bargaining rights and start as if they were starting from day one, or they were told that they had to go to other municipal offices and basically do other jobs that they were not trained for. So you have them working in hospitals as escorts. You have them mowing the lawn. You have some of them sitting outside waiting for something to do. In addition to that, you have a lot of them, because the different municipal unions have different health benefits. So you have part of them have lost their health benefits and their deductibles have skyrocketed. Some of them, there was a recent public hearing that some of them actually have not been paid for the last 4 months because of the dismantling of this public utility, which is the Autoridad de Energía Electricidad. You have the files that were not passed over. And so there was no records to substantiate the hours that they were actually working, right? Because we know what bureaucratic nightmares those could be. And so there's workers that haven't been paid in 4 months. So you have workers that are actually feeling depressed, feeling completely overwhelmed by this experience on an emotional, traumatic level, because they haven't been paid for months and the bills are rising. And the energy bill of Luma is also rising, right? They just were approved another increase, even though the outages throughout the island are like 19,000 people, 100,000 people on a continuous basis. They're paying more for their energy than we pay in New York City per kilowatt, which is pretty outrageous. And when I say colonial unionism, it's the IBW. The reason why Luma Energies came into agreement with the IBW is they want to access federal dollars. They want to access the FEMA funds. They cannot access the FEMA funds without some type of union entity. So they prefer to get into it with IBW than to actually respect the collective bargaining of UTIER. And what we want to be clear is that we want the cancellation of the Luma contract. We want the restoration of the public utility, and we want what the people want in Puerto Rico, which is queremos sol. There should be renewable energy. When we look at Biden's plan, right, for infrastructure, etc., it talks about renewable energy. There should not be the perpetuation of fossil fuels. It's also against the laws in Puerto Rico. And it's not only that Luma would have access to the electrical grid, it's also the natural water reservoirs. That poses a real threat to farming in Puerto Rico. There's been a resurgence of independent farmers. And if these water reserves, 75% of them are in control of Luma Energy and the fiber optics, who are also part of the Autoridad Eléctrica, we're talking about a whole monopoly system controlled by one entity. And so price gouging can be excessive. They can choose what areas based on income. We know that Dorado is equivalent to, Yorkville in Manhattan, where Donald Trump lived, right? 121 zip code, one of the richest zip codes in the United States. So they can pick and choose who they want to give services to. And the danger here is there are, as Vanessa mentioned, there's a whole movement of gated communities that could create their own or can pay for their own, like solar energies and all these things. And what happens to those people who have been living in communities in the mountains, in Hajuja and stuff? They're going to be cut off from services, right? And we also know right now that Luma does not have enough line people. And so when there's anybody makes a call, that by you should know that the phones ring and people do not speak Spanish, okay? It's outrageous, okay? And when you get somebody to come out on a call, there isn't enough line people. So it can take you 5 days to get a repair. This is impacting the equipment, the medical equipment in hospitals and people's homes, because when you have constant outages, it actually damages medical equipment. So you're talking about a life-threatening situation. And so, you know, in the diaspora and in Puerto Rico, we're calling for the cancellation of Luma Energy contract. This just has to end, period. And we are also asking for the dismantling of the Fiscal Control Board, because the Fiscal Control Board really is a collection agency for Wall Street. That's what it is. It's there to represent Wall Street and the issues of Wall Street, and it's a money free-for-all. And it's not in any way, first of all, we don't acknowledge that debt. We don't say restructure the debt. We say the debt is illegal and odious. And so it has to go. We don't recognize that debt. And we are in favor of the independence of Puerto Rico under 1514, which is the United Nations, right? And we're going to emphasize the question of independence versus decolonization, because decolonization has been co-opted by the statehooders, okay? And a lot of them say decolonization is statehood. No, it's not. And Congress, let me clarify, Congress is the only one that can vote to admit a state. And we know that Congress will never agree to a state, and that Puerto Rico, the people of Puerto Rico, have the right to a sovereign nation. So that's what has to happen.
I just want to add a couple points, having just been there. The power outages, the blackouts, are happening on a very regular basis. So I spent 9 days there, and my family lost power 4 times, right? Some of those times was 2 days at a time. It was like 98 degrees out, you know, no air conditioning, no fan, no Wi-Fi. So somebody like my mom, who was trying to work, do remote work while she was there, wasn't able to. My little cousins weren't able to do schoolwork. There's a lot of things that are impacted. And that same point about our seniors, our elderly population, not having access to a fan during this heat or medical equipment is something that's really dire. It definitely, as somebody who was watching that, I was incredulous that people have to live this way, right? On top of all the other things. And even though there are a lot of pro-statehood people, right, pushing for a different agenda, they are against the privatization of utilities too, right? This isn't an independent or socialist like agenda. This is something that most Puerto Ricans agree is bad. And we have some evidence of how that works here, because as you know, I work on telecommunications policy, and we had a movement for net neutrality, which is to have the FCC oversee internet telecommunication services as a utility. And we saw during the pandemic how critical it was for people to have that in their households. And what happens when there's not competition with internet companies and when prices aren't capped, right? What you see is price gouging, bad service, slow connectivity, and people who are not able to be connected. And so that is what happens when you have a utility that is privatized, right? Like I said, this is happening here in real time with telecommunications. And that is what is going to happen once this utility becomes privatized. And after asking people, I talked to a lot of people about the blackouts. There is a belief that it's being done on purpose to generate support for privatization. My cousin is an electrical worker, and he said there is no reason, there's nothing wrong with the equipment in most of these outages. There's something else going on where they are purposely cutting off the electricity. And that's very troubling, because you're playing with people's lives. And then the other thing that my family members were informing me about was this fairly new movement to import natural gas to the island. Fracking, right? Fracking is what they do here in Pennsylvania. And we know how destructive and evil fracking is and how it contaminates our air, water, and land. And it seems preposterous, right, to bring fracking from the United States all the way to Puerto Rico. You're using just as much energy to bring it to the island as what you would expend using fracking. And yet there are not resources or, a huge acceptance of renewable energy, right? Like solar power is a no-brainer, wind power is a no-brainer. And yet instead of doing what makes sense and what's safe for the environment and could be sustainable by communities who could build their own, they're trying to import dirty natural gas, right? And so that's another propaganda campaign. And they asked me, what do you think of natural gas? And I said, yeah, well, do you know where it comes from and how they extract it? Let me tell you about that, because if you knew, you wouldn't be so quick. And it's also not sustainable, right? It's a boom and bust industry. So they don't even have enough natural gas to continue to power Puerto Rico for the next couple of decades. And so I just wanted to make those points about how serious the blackout situation is right now and how intentional and manipulative it is in order to, enforce privatization on the citizens of Puerto Rico.
I'm glad that you bring that in, Vanessa, and I think Lorraine mentioned too some mountainous regions that I remember hearing right at the start, right as soon before the debris had been picked up. There was a concerted effort to keep some of the mountainous regions without electric power because that's where the mining interests wanted to move in. So it's extremely important that we understand, like you all are saying, how these crises are used to continue to wage colonial war. I just want to make a couple announcements, and then I want to make sure that we don't end tonight without talking about Vieques and Culebra. And I think we'll bring in Monisha at that point as well too, who's actually in Vieques right now. But before I do, I just want to make two quick announcements. One is about Workers' World. Workers' World newspaper has been in continuous circulation since 1959, and we're a daily news service. If you go to workers.org, you can enter your email address and you can sign up for new articles from a revolutionary perspective every day. We exchange articles with our allies in the movement. We have articles from our great allies like Lorraine. And it's really an invaluable revolutionary media source, particularly for our subscribers who are currently incarcerated. Often a print newspaper is the only way to get news to folks inside the prisons, let alone revolutionary socialist news. And one thing that we've been doing more often on these live streams is talking about political prisoners in particular. And I thought, what better opportunity than tonight to talk about Ana Belén Montes, who's a Puerto Rican woman. She's been held hostage in federal prison for nearly 20 years. But due to the hard work of Puerto Rican activists and others, we are talking about resistance and struggle. Montes has, the movement has forced the federal government to release Ana Belén Montes early, and we're hoping as early as next year. For those who don't know, Ana Belén Montes actually worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency, for U.S. intelligence. And it was there that she learned about the numerous strategies the U.S. has used to destabilize Cuba. Many of the same strategies we're talking about tonight, including the embargo, whether it comes in the form of a blockade or something like the Jones Act, which is used against Puerto Rico. And like Chelsea Manning, like Daniel Hale, she allegedly shared classified information about imperialist ventures with the Cuban government for 16 years before she was caught and charged with espionage. Though it must be said that this information reportedly not only helped Cuban people protect the revolution, but even protect the life of Fidel Castro from one of the innumerable assassination attempts the US plotted. And during her trial, Montes said, "I engaged in the activity that brought me before you because I obeyed my conscience rather than the law. I believe our government's policy towards Cuba is cruel and unfair, profoundly unneighborly, and I felt morally obligated to help the island defend itself from our efforts to impose our values and our political system on it. So I just wanted to say here to that. Free Ana Belén Montes. We know that Joe Biden is our current warden in chief, so we can't just assume that this, is going to be honored. We need to make sure to fight that she is free from imperialist custody once and for all. So thanks for that announcement, for us, for letting me make that announcement. I want to also bring in Monisha, if you would like to join us. And Lorraine, earlier you used the term a colony of a colony. Could you sort of kick us off and talk about the particular resistance in Vieques and Culebra?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I think it's very important to understand that when Puerto Rico, or the mainland, right, is experiencing some of the issues that Culebra and Vieques experiences them at 3 or 4 levels. So when you're talking about right now, there's a lot of food insecurity because people are not making ends meet. And in Culebra and Vieques, and I've been there when I've traveled there, there are actual people that go and shop in the mainland, which is main island of Puerto Rico, and actually bring shopping carts onto the lanchas in Vieques and Culebra and take that home with them, because the price of food is 2 and 3 times more. So you can imagine, it's unimaginable that in Puerto Rico, people are experiencing such food insecurity because of such a large percentage of the food is imported. And then not only the imports that you get from the United States, but also the cost of importing it into Vieques and Culebra is another level, another taxation level. So this is causing a tremendous strain on working class people, because sometimes they don't know where their next meal is going. And the levels of homelessness, and this is leading to the exile of people from the island. I know Monisha could go more into depth with that, and I'm looking forward to what she has to say, being there on a daily basis. But I think we have to understand that if Puerto Rico, the mainland, has problems with healthcare providers, there aren't any healthcare providers when you look at Vieques and Culebra. When you're looking at the fact that people cannot secure passage on an online system. I tried to, I was on there on vacation, and I literally had to leave early because you have to go online, and everyone doesn't have, as Vanessa was saying, people do not have access to the internet. So you actually have to look around, and we're talking about, again, a group of people that are not digitally savvy, having to look for someone to make a reservation, and then to realize that they can't get a reservation. Or if they make a reservation and they're trying to come back from Ceiba, they can't get a boat back. So they're stuck. And not only are they stuck, I mean, if they try to stay in a hotel or something like that, the prices are like $150 a night, or $80 a night. So it's an untenable situation. It's really extremely unfortunate, but everything becomes exacerbated to so much higher level when you deal with the issues of Vieques and Culebra, in terms of resources, in terms of being listened to with the issues that they're facing. It just completely ignored by the municipal governments of Puerto Rico in the mainland.
Remember earlier, Lorraine, you made the comparison. It's like if the Staten Island ferry shut down, for our New York listeners. And I was just thinking, when you said that, how would you find a hotel room in Manhattan if you weren't able to get home to Staten Island? It's
absolutely. I can't afford a hotel room.
Right. Yeah.
On the spot. Yeah, absolutely. That's the way it is. Absolutely, that's the way it is. So it's, you know, and it's leading to the exile of so many Viequenses. And it's very unfortunate because Viequenses are fighting and are struggling to really remain on the island. And there's so many homes that are being foreclosed, and they're being, you know, again, grabbed. It's a land grab by these billionaires, and millionaires can afford, you know, to grab the land and create these, you know, Airbnbs and these luxury. And when you see these ads on YouTube and you see these things, it paints a completely different reality. And, you know, it's, and you see that people that live there have to work in hospitality or tourism instead of those types of incentives, that money being filtered into opportunities, local opportunities for people. That money is being filtered into, you know, tax exemptions for the affluent, the very wealthy, you know. And then you have the creation of NGOs. You know, you have these NGOs coming in and offering services. The government should be responsible for the services of people, and we shouldn't have all of these nonprofits doing things and taking away the responsibility from government. You find that that's happening here. This movement for privatization, and giving these contracts. You know, I'm a New York City school teacher, and this whole push for, you know, privatization of education. Well, let me tell you, in New York City, the Success Academy, which is a charter, $564,000 Eva Moskowitz makes as a CEO. She makes more money, okay, with less students, okay, managing charter schools than the chancellor of New York City Public Schools, Maisha Porter, okay, that makes like 345,000. Don't quote me exactly to the dollar, but thereabouts, okay? So there's this move, and this is happening as part of the neoliberal policies of privatizing things, and that privatization is necessarily better than public services. No, government should be able to give essential services to citizens. And these means of privatization is also a way, and we saw this in Haiti after the disaster, that there was all this funding and all these like NGOs and organizations coming in to do work. And then the money trail sort of disappears and the accountability disappears. And all of a sudden there was X amount of millions given for this project. And we saw this manifest after the earthquake in Haiti. And we were like, what happened? And so with Hurricane Maria, we have to ask all this funding. First of all, Hurricane Maria, the funding was allocated, but was never dispersed. We know that for a fact. Maybe like a 3% was dispersed, but the funding was never dispersed as it ought to be. Then you have the level of corruption, right? And then you have the fact that there are still people that have blue tarps, okay? And that don't have the adequate services that they should have. And we see this when we look at Louisiana. Right after Hurricane Katrina, we looked at the displacement, we looked at the charters, right? And the charters never were able to give the services to students, right? That public school system was able to give to students. You know, charter schools came in, and I was part of that discussion in another Workers' World panel, which was a very good discussion. And the impact on Louisiana and displacement of Louisiana of working class people. And so you see these things are mirrored, right, in communities of color and displaced communities, these mirrorings of privatization, disaster capitalism, right, as Naomi Campbell coined. I mean, yeah.
You know, I have to say, Lorraine, when you mentioned the blue tarps, I thought about our comrade Gloria Rubach down in Houston. Where, you know, there are still blue tarps up on roofs in neighborhoods from Hurricane Harvey back in 2017. It's incredible, some of the images that recur when people are under attack by this government. I want to ask Monisha if you can join us, because earlier today, Monisha, we were talking specifically about healthcare access in Vieques, and I wonder, you're there now, so you can come to us live from Vieques. If you would talk about healthcare access and maybe also the environmental impact of the former U.S. military base there.
Yeah, and thank you so much for allowing me the chance to speak. This has been incredible. Thank you, Lorraine, Fermin, and I'm sorry, Vanessa. I've learned so much from you three. So I'm Viequense. I was not born in Vieques. I rematriated in January 2020. I grew up with the legacy of Vieques though in my family. You know, my dad's one of those who left because of the poverty, because of the bombings and all of the problems that Lorraine and Vanessa have talked about. And so I'll start with what the US has done to the land and the water to create the health problems that we now have so much disparity around. And please, I have unstable internet, so let me know if you lose me. So Culebra was actually militarized and turned into a military installation in the early 1900s. And they were actually the first to resist and rebel and get rid of the US military in 1971, I believe. And so Culebra and Vieques were experiencing around the same time. Vieques, they started expropriating land and turning it into a bombing range around World War II time frame. And 2/3 of the island of Vieques, both ends, were taken and the population was smushed into the center. And what they did was they tested everything, every single thing from psychological warfare. So you think about hybrid warfare and all of the different elements that comprise it. Every single one of those elements of US total war has been tested in Vieques and Culebra. And so with kinetic warfare, which is like the bombs, you know, the different types of ordnance, you've got chemical warfare, biological warfare, all of it. There's Agent Orange in Vieques. We do not know and we will never know exactly what was used and how much of it was used. And Vieques was also rented out to other countries, other countries that are involved in NATO. And they also brought their weapons here and tested them. So right now we have a hard enough time getting information from the Navy, who's doing a supposed cleanup of all of this unexploded ordnance. But included depleted uranium, I'll add, 295 rounds were accidentally dropped one time. And so this is the situation. This is why Vieques and Culebra have some of the highest cancer rates in Puerto Rico and in the United States, because we're surrounded by this constantly. And so for a long time, you know, the struggle took place. And finally in the early 2000s, 2003, I believe, was when they ended the bombings and then closed Camp Garcia and closed Roosevelt Roads in Ceiba, which unfortunately I am now becoming an exile from Vieques because of the ferry problems and everything. I cannot access healthcare and I have to move to the Big Island so I can get the healthcare that I need. So this brings us into the healthcare disparities that exist. Vieques and Culebra have never had adequate healthcare facilities ever. They say some of the narrative and the punishment that the colonies of the colony receive for resisting US militarism and imperialism on our lands has been, well, you had it better when the Navy was there. This is what you get because you kicked out the Navy. Then you shouldn't have kicked out the Navy because you had a hospital, you had better ferry system, you had this and you had that. That's not exactly true either. So since then, now, prior to Hurricane Maria in Vieques, and I'll speak more to Vieques because I know more about Vieques, but I'll encourage folks to watch a webinar that I helped organize with community leaders from Culebra and Vieques that was sponsored by the US Peace Council. If I could ask for help in sharing those links, I really appreciate it, because I I'm afraid that if I try to do it myself, I'll lose you guys. So the hospital situation in Vieques was terrible before Maria. We had a CDT, a Center for Diagnosis and Treatment, which is not a place where people could get cancer treatment. It's not like a hospital you would see in the United States, not even as good as a community hospital in the United States. So then Maria comes, Irma comes, and that center is destroyed. And supposedly there's money from FEMA that's supposed to go to reconstructing this CDT, but we want a hospital. We want babies to be born in Vieques again, instead of people having to get on a boat or a plane or be helicoptered out to have their babies born in Fajardo. We want Viequenses to be born in Vieques. We want Culebrenses to be born in Culebra. So we want, you know, the level of healthcare that Viequenses deserve and that Culebrenses deserve. And so what's happening now is 4 years later, we still have the makeshift CDT that was created out of a high school gym. It was the storm shelter, which is now this wannabe hospital, which has been unreal during COVID. And the story with FEMA changes all the time. The money that they say they have available for us, that they say that the municipality has to front a certain amount of it first, which that's impossible. And then now we have Pierre Luisi, who, as Fermin mentioned, is the lawyer for the Fiscal Control Board and the governor at the same time, there by crooked means, I will add, presenting some grand design for a new hospital for Vieques that there is not money for. Because the money that FEMA said they will give us eventually could not cover what is required to make this center happen. So there's that. There's the fact that when I moved home in January 2020, I've lost count of how many funeral processions have gone through town in front of my house. Like, it's a death a week. It seemed like. And now, especially after COVID, and it's children dying too. We lost Heidelise Ventura, which in the video you played in the beginning of this webinar, there's a little bit about her in there. She was 13. And not that long ago, we lost a toddler. We're losing elders. We're losing people of around my age in their 30s and 40s. It's all of those things that are happening in Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua, all of the sanctioned countries right now that the US is punishing for saying, no, we are not going to allow you to rape us anymore. The same conditions are what we are experiencing in Vieques and Culebra. And on top of that, we have the same conditions that Lorraine, Fermin, and Vanessa have described in Puerto Rico, where we have the neocolonialism and the colonialism, and we have the Bitcoin bros coming to colonize us, and we have the intersectional imperialists that are here. There's a Rainbow Realty. If you look up Rainbow Realty, you can see what the housing prices are like. You can see Island Realty. You can look up all of the real estate agencies in Vieques and Culebra and sort your search from the most expensive property down, and you can see what it's like trying to find a place to live. And there's another reason why I have to leave. I cannot afford to pay, and I'm sick and tired of renting from gringos. And I mean, so, and I have means. I'm a disabled veteran, and I have the luxury of a disability check every month. So I have it a lot easier than most of my friends and relatives in Vieques who don't have that, who have to work in tourism, who have to work in these industries that Lorraine was mentioning, which are not like what their life goals are. You don't wake up and say, yeah, I want to be a server in a restaurant for the rest of my life. Serving people who disrespect me every day, who don't care about our land, who don't care about our lives, who look at us as objects there to serve them and make them feel good and have a nice vacation. you know? So we've got a lot of gun violence, we've got a lot of drug violence, and that's another aspect of the interventionism in Vieques and also in Puerto Rico, because one of the ways that Vieques is still militarized, and please stop me at any time if I go too long, because there's a lot to say. But we still have a relocatable over-the-horizon radar system transmitter in Vieques. So the Navy's still in Vieques, and they have still used us for their militarism and imperialist intentions in South America. And
Manisha, thank you so much for
sure.
a really
Thanks.
powerful statement on that. And I hope that you can join us again sometime soon. There's something the way you framed it is going to stick with me too, about how children, Viequense children, can't even be born in Vieques in a hospital. I don't know. There's something beyond everything there. And I wonder also, and thank you, Manisha, so much for that. I want to ask Fermin too. You are from Vieques. If you have anything you'd like to add to this conversation before we sort of go to closing remarks.
No, like I said, I go to Vieques every year. I mean, I visit a friend of mine, and I'm gonna be honest with you. The reason why I grew politically was because of him, because he was related to the fishermen in Puerto Rico, in Vieques. And the fishermen, for those of you who know the struggle of the liberation of Vieques, it started with the fishermen because they could not fish. And they had to then find a way to stop the bombings when they would practice their military exercises. It was the fishermen who started that struggle. I always believe that we talk about great leaders in Puerto Rico. I mean, we talk about Pedro Albizu Campos, Betances, Juan Antonio Corregel, all our great women like Lolita Lebron and like Blanca Canales and many others. We don't talk about Carlos Zenon. We don't talk about this great leader, who was a man of color, who I got the respect for so much, for his struggle, for his sacrifice, for leading that fight in Vieques. And people don't talk about Carlos Zenon, who's also written a very good book. And I have the book home, and it's dear to my heart because I was part of that struggle. I was part of getting arrested for that, and how he used tactics, how he himself was, he said he went to the military service, and he joined the military because of a childhood situation where one of his best friends actually landed on a landmine, and it killed him, and pretty much, and he was the one who had to pick him up, and he said his head fell off when he picked him up, and that he decided to join the U.S. As a Marine. He says, I want to learn the tactic to get rid of these guys and so they can get the hell out of my island. And he was arrested for it, and he kept the struggle going. And we were able to, in 2003, to get the U.S. Navy out of Vieques, because of who Carlos Zenon is. And I remember visiting him every year, and just sitting down, just feeling like he was one of those great patriots. And, he's there with me. He's there like Albizu Campos is, the reverence that I have for Albizu Campos is the reverence that I have for Carlos Tazos, So, I mean, you gotta, read. I wish this book was in English so you could read it, how great of a hero he was to me and to the people of Vieques. And so, but like I said, what Manisha was talking about, you go there, my buddy, I think he was born in Fajardo also. He wasn't born in Vieques, and he's a longtime Vieques resident, and basically I learned, listen, I became a radical, sitting down with him in my uncle's bar, having a beer. And this guy's talking to me about Vieques and talking about something that I completely did not even know, that we were being bombed, because like all our speakers are talking about, Puerto Ricans don't know their history. They're so colonized that they don't know their history. African Americans know a little more of their history. They know who Malcolm X is. They know who Frederick Douglass is. They know all these great radicals and great revolutionaries. We're not even taught that in Puerto Rico, and less here. That's all I have to say.
Thank
I
you.
just want to
Fermin.
give a shout out to Radio Vieques and Robert Rabin. I spent 2 years helping build and launch Radio Vieques with Prometheus Radio Project. They're one of the only progressive anti-imperialist stations in the whole island, and was so critical that they were there because a lot of the stations don't transmit as far as Vieques. So there's another way that they're cut off from information. And I'm just going to drop their information in the chat because they're a community radio station, and they are also very committed to preserving the history of the independence movement and also the struggle against the Navy. And so again, that's why it's so important to have alternative media structures. And I'll just say 2 more things, which is there's no shortage of boats, right? There's boats everywhere. They're just privately owned and chartered and reserved for tourists. So you can go onto Airbnb and you'll find plenty of boats to Culebra and Vieques. They're just not for Puerto Ricans. And so those waterways are also colonized and dominated by yachts of rich people. And I lived in Fajardo when I was younger. So Fajardo also gets the other end of that with congested traffic, with trash and litter of tourists going to Fajardo, to that port, to get to Culebra and Vieques. And so, there's a real congestion that happens. It's the reason why even in our city in Philly, we don't want certain neighborhoods developed. We don't want stadiums in Center City. We don't want, parking garages and things of that nature, because they don't want the influx of people and the trash and the pollution that comes with that. And you see that in Fajardo, right? Because it's a ferry point where the majority of people that are trying to get over there are these day tripper tourists coming from the United States. And so you don't see that as much in other parts. You're like, why is this part really dirty? What's all this trash? Like, what is this happen? You're like, well, that's because they're all trying to get on these boats. So that's one thing, again, that, I've seen repeatedly when I go to Puerto Rico. And then the last thing is that, how did COVID get to Puerto Rico? Came on a boat, on a cruise ship from tourists. How did it get to Vieques and Culebra? It came from tourists on those ferries who brought that virus onto the islands. They still continue to ignore the mandates and, disrespect the local regulations. And there's still no concern for the potential to spread a deadly virus among the population of Puerto Rico. And when you're on an island, right, and there's nowhere for you to go, right? We saw a lot of people leave cities to go to rural areas on the US mainland. People were going to Vermont, people were going to upstate New York to get away. Where are you supposed to go on Vieques? There's literally no escape from that. And so I want people to imagine what it was like to live under quarantine when everything is shut down on this teeny tiny island. And if people look at the map, you'll see that half of Vieques is national park, right? So it's not even, people are concentrated in a very small area, which is what makes it hard to move around and to be able to build things. And so, it was very difficult and painful for people. There's still a lot of collective trauma from those shutdowns, from being cut off from the rest of the world. And until you live on an island and you are cut off from imports, and you're cut off from communication, you're cut off from travel, you'll never truly understand the impact of this pandemic on places like that. We're so privileged in the United States. people really need to understand it's not like that in the rest of the world. And that's another reason why Puerto Rico remains a colony, right? We don't enjoy the same lifestyle just for the simple fact of its geographic location. So I just wanted to, make people aware of that as well. And then finally, that there's still so much land and water that has not been remediated as a result of the many decades of bombing and experiments and all of that. They still haven't cleaned that up. And we've seen that in other parts of the country and indigenous lands as well, in places where they've fracked, they just pick up and they leave and they don't do anything. And even Tesla brought all of these batteries, these like solar batteries, and they didn't work. And where did they leave them? They dumped them there on Vieques and did not take the garbage with them, and it's still there. So seeing is believing. I think it's important for people from the diaspora, if they can, to go and rematriate, as Monisha said, which is a really great word to use, right? Because instead of repatriate, we're like smashing the patriarchy there. It's never too late to learn your history and to reconnect with your culture and to go see what is happening and to care about Puerto Rico. And so if you're out there and you feel like you don't know much about the situation, it's never too late to learn more and to explore that.
And I need to thank all of you. I mean, there's a reason that we went almost a half hour longer than we normally do on these live streams, because this has been tremendous. And it's really an honor to be here with all of you as the only non-Puerto Rican in the discussions. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. And I want to make sure that people know that this is not going to be the last live stream we do on Puerto Rico. We have to have everybody back, right? So thank you for, I think before we wrap up, I'd like to give Lorraine a last chance to make any final comments. And once again, to thank you all for joining us.
Again, I'd like to thank Workers World for the opportunity to have this forum. I think that we cannot have the liberation of any part of the world without the liberation of Puerto Rico. That really has to be part, just like the liberation of Palestine and all the other liberations throughout the world. We are connected as workers throughout the world and against a system which is capitalism and neoliberalism. I also want to urge people to look through our pages. We're going to be launching a campaign against the Fiscal Control Board and the dismantling of the Fiscal Control Board. That is coming up soon. We also going to be launching very shortly a page called The Root of the Truth, which is geared towards canceling the Luma contract, which we know has devastating effects, and also promoting the renewable energy initiative that was created as a coalition, Queremos Sol. So we really need support in those endeavors. We'd like people to sign the petition that we have, Stop Union Busting, Support Energy Workers in Puerto Rico, and continue to support. I have given to, it's probably in the chat, Se Acabaron las Promesas, and it's at Jocelyn Velasquez, JSALP. They are a grassroots organization, no governmental funding. They have been involved in the fight against the Junta Control Fiscal. They have been involved with the environmental struggles, and they have been consistent working against these systems. And so we really would like you to support the grassroots, what's going on in the grassroots, because we know that this struggle is a long fight and is a difficult fight, especially when you're dealing with Fiscal Control Board and entities like John Paulson, who has cleared an area called Holy Spirit, which is in Rio Grande, to make the Regis Hotel, and is a millionaire that lives in New York. Unfortunately, so many of them live here. So please continue to support what's going on. And we want your support for the independence of Puerto Rico. That is the only option that will be a viable option for Puerto Rico, for Puerto Ricans to have the sovereignty of their own nation, to make agreements, to make decisions about the lives of Puerto Ricans. Thank you so much, everyone, for your support. And I look forward to coming back to have more discussions. Thank you. Muchas gracias y que viva Puerto Rico libre. Thank you.
Que viva Puerto Rico
Y
libre.
que viva Puerto Rico libre. Yep.
Fermin, can I invite you to say anything in closing as we end?
No, listen, it's all been said, you know, it's all been said. And we, like I said, I'm glad to see that. I thought everyone was a very good speaker. I think we all talked about, I guess, our personal experience with being colonized people that want to break the chains. Thank you.
Thanks. And I appreciate the anti-imperialist and class analysis that all of you brought to this. Vanessa, Fermin, Lorraine, Monisha, thank you all for being with us.
Can I just shout out that Fermin and I are part of a group in Philly,
Yes,
Philly
please.
Boricuas. And we have a Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We have a website. We are a grassroots group. We're volunteers. You know, everything that we do is out of our own pockets or from donations. We had a really successful campaign to send supplies and donations to Puerto Rico during the earthquakes. And we had a pretty successful get out the vote campaign during the election. We didn't promote any candidates, but we knew how important those mail-in ballots from Philly were at the at the end of the election. So, you know, Puerto Ricans historically have high voter turnout. So we really try to engage Puerto Ricans in North Philadelphia and West Kensington and get them activated politically. If you'd like to volunteer or learn more, or you want to engage with us, or you're on the island and you want to connect with the diaspora, please check us out, phillyboricuas@gmail.com, or find us on social media. We would love to hear from you.
It is not a demonstration in Philadelphia if the Philly Boricuas are not there. It's always a pleasure to work with you, comrades.
With our black and white Puerto Rican flags.
Damn right. I also, you know, as we end, I want to make sure that folks know about two upcoming events that are going to be taking place. There's going to be a protest this Sunday in Philadelphia to shut down SCI Fayette, which is a state prison in Pennsylvania that is the conditions of which are so toxic and so polluted. I mean, prisons, like so many of these US military bases, are essentially Superfund sites, all of them. When Vanessa was talking about fracking, you know, these prisons are all built on open coal mines that were dug up in the 18th and 19th centuries. So I want to invite people to come out to Eastern State Penitentiary on Sunday, the 19th at 1. I'm going to be there to speak about Bryant Arroyo, who is a Puerto Rican activist. He's been incarcerated for over 25 years for a crime he didn't commit, and he is an environmental activist behind bars. He does tremendous work. And also, just so folks know, on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, we're going to be having an event with Gail Walker from IFCO Pastors for Peace, with Dr. Samira Adri, who's a graduate of the Cuban Medical School, the Escuela Latinoamérica de Medicina, and also with Professor Vijay Prashad. So folks can check out that event on Tuesday. Once again, I want to thank Lorraine and Vanessa and Fermin and Monisha for joining us. Thank you, Marcello, for doing technical support tonight. And as we always say, build a worker's world, and viva, viva Puerto Rico libre.
Yeah, viva Puerto Rico libre.
Amén.
Viva Puerto Rico libre.